Rain tapped gently against the high windows of the 17th Precinct's evidence archive. A sound like soft fingers on glass. The room smelled of dust, old paper, and forgotten stories. Detective Ethan Cole stood in the center of the cavernous space. Sleeves rolled, collar open, staring down at a half-crushed cardboard box with no label. He hadn't meant to find it. He was helping clear out old case files, spring cleaning. The lieutenant had called it. Though spring was a month away and Chicago didn't believe in gentle seasons. But something about the unmarked box pulled at him. A feeling in his gut. The kind that had once kept him alive in alleyways and war zones. He cut the tape and lifted the lid. Inside were yellowed folders, a tangle of notes, Polaroids, and a small bag marked L. Ramirez, Evidence Reviewed, 2011. The case number was smudged, but the first page of the file was intact. Missing person, Lucas Mayer. Age 10. Last seen, July 14, 2011. Camp Renbrick, Black River State Forest. Ethan scanned the page. The clinical words framing something far more brutal. A boy had vanished from a summer camp and no one had seen or heard from him since. The search had lasted a week. No witnesses, no body, no closure. The notes ended with a phrase he'd seen too many times. Case suspended due to lack of leads. He closed the folder and stood still for a long moment. Across the room, Rex lifted his head. Rex was never far from Ethan. The German Shepherd was 6 now. Grizzled around the muzzle, sharp as ever, a former military working dog. He'd served in Afghanistan, where he'd survived 2 IEDs and more nightmares than Ethan cared to imagine. They'd met during Ethan's final deployment, one broken soldier recognizing another. Back in Chicago, they'd been inseparable ever since. That evening, Ethan sat at his desk with the Lucas Mayer file spread out across it. Rain had turned to sleet. Rattling against the window, Rex lay nearby, ears twitching occasionally in his sleep. The report was thin. Just a handful of interviews, a basic map of the campgrounds, and a few blurry photos of the area near where Lucas had last been seen, a stretch of pine forest near the lake, a maintenance trail that led deeper into the woods, and the weathered stump of a broken tree. Something didn't sit right. Ethan had reviewed hundreds of missing person files in his career, cases with clearer suspects, stronger motives, tighter timelines, but this one had gaps. Unasked questions. Why was Lucas walking alone? Why hadn't the camp filed the report until the next day? Why did the counselor's statement feel rehearsed? He made his decision by midnight. By morning, Ethan and Rex were on the road, heading north out of the city toward Black River State Forest. The snow fell in slow sheets, covering the highway in a soft blur. Ethan drove in silence, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the file beside him. Rex sat upright in the passenger seat, gaze fixed forward like a co-pilot trained for war. When they passed the old Renbrick camp sign, now faded and half buried under snow, Ethan felt the weight of time press against the windshield. The camp had closed the year after Lucas disappeared. No surprise. A child goes missing under your watch. And even if no one gets blamed, the stain never leaves. The cabins were still standing. Barely. Boards covered the windows. Weeds had pushed through cracked stone paths. Nature had already begun reclaiming what man had built and abandoned. Ethan stepped out of the truck. The cold hit hard. He opened the back and let Rex out. The dog sniffed the air. Ears high, tail stiff. They started with the lake. The frozen surface stretched wide and empty. The wind carving lines across the ice like forgotten handwriting. The last known sighting of Lucas was near the water's edge. Late afternoon, by a counselor who said the boy was walking back toward the cabins alone after group time. But something was off. The footprints that had been found led away from the cabins, toward the woods, then disappeared. Ethan followed the same path now. Boots crunching through snow, eyes scanning. That's when Rex stopped. The shepherd had frozen mid-step. Head tilted sharply toward a narrow section of forest, just past the old maintenance shed. His hackles rose, breath steaming in short bursts. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Ethan followed his gaze. Something here. Rex moved forward slowly, nose to the ground, tail lowered, body alert. He turned once to glance at Ethan, then back to the trees. Ethan stepped forward, hand instinctively brushing the grip of his sidearm. But it wasn't fear that gripped him. It was memory. Something about the silence, the curve of the trail, the shape of the broken tree in the distance. Something deeply familiar. Rex stopped beside a half-buried log and began to circle. Nose twitching. Ethan crouched beside him. There, in the snow, was a shallow depression, almost unnoticeable. But old instincts kicked in. The earth was sunken just enough. Pressed down like something heavy had once been buried there. Decades of weather had smoothed it over. But the trace remained. Rex began to whine softly. Not from fear. From recognition. Ethan felt his skin go cold beneath his coat. This wasn't random. Rex had smelled something. Remembered something. The dog's nose dropped into the dirt, pawing slightly, then stopped. His body stiffened. Ethan placed a hand on his back. "We're going to need a forensic team." He stood slowly, heart heavy with something more than dread. Lucas Mayer hadn't just wandered off. And if Rex's instincts were right, this forgotten clearing wasn't just a coincidence, it was a grave. Back in the truck, Ethan sat with the engine running, warming his fingers, staring at the forest. He reached into the glove box and pulled out a small, dented flask. He hesitated, then put it back. Not today. Instead, he turned to Rex, who was lying quietly in the back seat. Eyes alert, ears still turned toward the woods. "You remember something, don't you?" Rex didn't move. Ethan reached for his notebook. Lucas Mayer. Renbrick Camp. 2011. One missing boy. 12 years of silence. One dog that never forgets. He looked up at the trees. "We're reopening this case." And in that moment, as snow fell quietly across the forgotten camp, the past exhaled into the present. It was time to find out what it had buried. Snow drifted down in lazy spirals as Ethan and Rex returned to the forest. It had been 3 days since they discovered the shallow depression near the old maintenance trail. 3 days since Ethan called in a forensics team from Madison, who confirmed what he already knew. The Earth had once held a body, but it had been moved. Only fragments remained, trace organic material, too degraded for DNA, too minimal for identification. Still, it was enough to classify the scene as a likely secondary burial. Someone had hidden something here and come back for it. Ethan knew they were close. Too close. Rex had been restless ever since. He paced near the window at night, whined when the wind shifted, stared into the trees like they whispered things humans couldn't hear. His instincts were drawing him deeper. So Ethan followed. The sun hadn't yet risen when they reached the ravine beyond the campgrounds, a craggy scar in the earth formed by an old glacier, now half hidden by pine and brush. Few search parties had combed this far back 12 years ago. The terrain was too treacherous, too dense. But Rex pressed forward, his nose to the frozen ground, moving with purpose. The trail wound tighter, rocks slick with frost, branches clawed at Ethan's jacket. Then, abruptly, the shepherd halted. He barked once, sharp, direct. Ethan stepped beside him. They had reached a shallow cave, no more than 6 feet deep, its mouth hidden behind a thicket of fallen limbs. Inside was darkness, still and thick. Rex lowered his head and crept in. Ethan followed. The flashlight beam swept over damp stone, patches of frozen moss, and then, a shape, half buried in dirt and leaves. Wedged between 2 boulders, he crouched, moved the debris with gloved hands. And there it was, a small bone, white, porous, unmistakably human. Not an adult, a child. Ethan sat back on his heels, breath fogging in the cold cave. His chest tightened. This wasn't speculation anymore. This wasn't just reopening an old case. This was real. By nightfall, the story had exploded. Cold case reignited. Remains found in Lucas Meyer disappearance. Missing for 12 years. New lead uncovered by detective and former military dog. Justice in the Snow. The Chicago case that wouldn't stay buried. Ethan didn't speak to reporters. He didn't answer calls from internal. He barely acknowledged the media vans parking just outside the precinct. Instead, he sat in the briefing room, rereading the original witness statements. Every counselor, every staff member, every registered visitor from Camp Renbrick. July 2011. And one name kept jumping out. Daniel Morrow, 29 at the time. Assistant counselor. Background check clear. Interviewed once. Gave a vague but cooperative statement. Claimed he last saw Lucas during lunch and assumed the boy had joined a group hike that afternoon. There was no follow-up. Now, Daniel Morrow went by another name. Reverend Dan Morrow, pastor of a small Lutheran church in Monroe County, less than 15 miles from the old campsite. Ethan circled the name in red ink. The church was quiet the next day, half buried in snow and silence. St. Andrew's stood on a lonely corner near a frozen field, its steeple reaching into the gray sky like a question. Ethan parked across the street. Rex sat alert, watching the doors. The sanctuary was open. Inside, Warm light glowed from wall sconces. Wooden pews stretched down both sides. Polished but worn. The smell of old incense lingered, pine, cedar, ash. Morrow stood at the altar, organizing hymnals. He looked up when Ethan stepped in. A smile touched his face. "Help you, officer?" "Detective," Ethan said. "Ethan Cole. I'd like to ask you a few questions about Camp Renbrick." The smile didn't vanish, but it stopped growing. "That was a long time ago," Morrow said. "I don't know how much help it'll be. You worked there the summer Lucas Mayer disappeared." "I did. You said in your statement you saw him at lunch." "I did. But he was reported missing that evening. You never noticed he didn't return." Morrow set down the hymnal. "It was chaos, detective. A camp full of kids. We were understaffed. We thought he'd gone home early. Maybe walked off in a group. It was summer. Things blurred." Ethan stepped closer. His voice remained calm. "The bones we found last week belonged to a child. A forensic anthropologist confirmed the approximate age range matches Lucas. They were left in a cave near the camp. Far enough to be hidden. Close enough to return to." A flicker passed through Morrow's eyes. He turned away. "I remember him," Morrow said after a pause. "Quiet, polite, always had a book in his hand. He didn't like the lake. Or the other kids." Ethan stepped forward again. "You were one of the last adults to see him. And now you live 15 miles from where his body was likely moved after the fact." Morrow's voice was barely audible. "Coincidence? Maybe," Ethan said. "But I've stopped believing in those." He handed the pastor a card. "If you remember anything new, anything at all, call me." Morrow took the card without a word. And Ethan turned and left. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat at his desk. Coffee gone cold, the room quiet but not still. Rex lay beside the couch. Eyes open. 1,000 thoughts swirled, but one wouldn't leave. Morrow hadn't been surprised. He hadn't asked how the boy died. He hadn't asked what bone. He hadn't shown the confusion of an innocent man confronted with terrible news. He'd just paused, like someone remembering a bad dream they thought they'd forgotten. Ethan opened the old file again. He stared at Morrow's original statement. Something clicked. A note at the bottom. Morrow helped supervise Canoe Group B-led afternoon hike on July 14. Ethan flipped to a map of the campgrounds. The hiking trail passed close, very close, to the ravine where the cave was found. He stood suddenly, grabbed his coat. Outside, the snow had stopped, but the cold remained. Ethan stared into the dark night. The quiet of the city too calm, too watchful. Beside him, Rex sat up. There was more to dig. And the bones had begun to speak. Snow had turned to ice. Chicago wore its cold like a second skin. And Detective Ethan Cole moved through it with quiet purpose. He'd seen brutality dressed in many forms: rage, greed, desperation, but there was something else. Something colder, about a predator who smiled from behind a pulpit. And Dan Morrow smiled too easily. Rex had known it from the start. Each time they approached the church, the shepherd grew tense, ears back, tail rigid, body low. Not fear, not aggression, recognition, a soldier's memory triggered by scent. Posture, something unspoken. Each time Morrow came near, Rex's lip twitched. A low growl built in his throat. It wasn't a warning. It was instinct. Ethan started digging harder. What he found wasn't proof, but it was enough. Daniel Morrow had worked as a camp counselor or guest speaker at 5 different youth camps between 2006 and 2013. Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, all small, rural, underfunded programs with high staff turnover. Most had shuttered since. Ethan made calls. At first, just to confirm records. But then came the pattern. 2008. Grand Traverse County, Michigan. Missing girl. Age 9. Case closed as a presumed runaway. 2010. Polk County, Wisconsin. Teenage boy vanished during night hike. No body ever found. 2012. Ramsey County, Minnesota. Summer volunteer arrested for inappropriate behavior. Charges dropped. Morrow's name appears in a reference note. No follow-up. 1 missing child is a tragedy. 3 or more is a pattern. Ethan didn't sleep for the next 2 nights. He mapped the disappearances, the timelines, Morrow's travel history, reconstructed through tax records, social media, and a few photos Ethan pulled from local church newsletters. The pieces didn't just fit, they overlapped. Morrow had been in the right place. At the right time, every time. Still, nothing held in court, no DNA, no confessions, no witnesses. The devil's greatest disguise had always been respectability. The FBI entered the case the following week. Special Agent Melissa Griggs, early 40s. Sharp, composed, no patience for ego, took the lead. She and Ethan met in a secure conference room at the federal building. The walls lined with caseboards and crime scene photos. Lucas Mayer's file now had a red tab marked "Priority." 6 other faces joined his on the wall. Griggs didn't waste time. "We believe we're looking at a long-term, mobile predator," she said. "He's methodical, selective, probably operates under the radar using religious programs, seasonal work, or charity organizations. Moves often, stays quiet." Ethan crossed his arms. "You think he has help?" "Possibly. At least passive enablers. People who don't ask questions when a volunteer changes names or uses church connections to jump between states." She tapped one photo, an overhead shot of Camp Renbrick's Central Lodge. "He's not spontaneous. That cave you found, it wasn't luck. It was known. He scoped that land, probably years ahead. We're dealing with premeditation on a massive scale." Ethan leaned against the wall. "He knew we'd come. He's been staying ahead of us." Griggs nodded. "Which means he's watching now." Ethan returned to Monroe County with permission to continue field surveillance under FBI oversight. The town hadn't changed, but Morrow had. He was quieter during his sermons. More precise, more careful, but he was still there, smiling after service, shaking hands, helping carry food donations into the church hall. A man of the cloth. Beloved by his flock. Ethan watched him from the back pew every Sunday. Rex stayed outside, sitting in the snow with his ears twitching. never taking his eyes off the doors. 3 days later, something broke. A girl named Emily Hodges, aged 12, reported a creepy man following her from the library in La Crosse. She described a tan car with a cracked rearview mirror and a small cross hanging from the dash. Ethan ran the vehicle description. The plates belonged to St. Andrew's Church. Registered to Dan Morrow. When approached, Morrow claimed he'd stopped to pray in the lot nearby and hadn't seen the girl. There was no footage, no clear evidence. The car smelled freshly cleaned. He smiled when questioned, but Rex reacted again, his growl deeper this time. Teeth bared. The dog had to be pulled back. Griggs pushed for a warrant. The judge denied it. Too circumstantial. Ethan nearly punched a wall. The next week, Morrow vanished. Didn't show up to Sunday service. Phone off. Church office empty. Parishioners said he'd gone on a spiritual retreat. Left a note saying he needed time for reflection. But Ethan knew. It wasn't retreat. It was escape. Griggs issued a bolo within the hour. FBI analysts found financial activity in Iowa, then nothing. A shell trail. Prepaid phones. Gas station stops. No credit cards. Just shadows. The predator had gone underground. That night, Ethan sat alone in his apartment. Rex asleep at his feet. A bottle of scotch untouched on the table. The photos stared back at him. Lucas, Emily, the others. A war was coming, but this enemy wore a preacher's smile. He looked down at Rex. You knew, from the beginning. The dog stirred, head lifting slowly, eyes calm but alert. Ethan didn't need a reply. There would be no rest until the past was dragged fully into the light. And somewhere out there, a man who had fooled everyone, families, police, churches, was watching, hiding, waiting, but not forever, because now Ethan was watching back. And this time, the silence wouldn't save him. The storm rolled over the forest like a freight train. Rain slashed the windshield of Ethan's truck as wind howled through the trees. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the road in sharp, white streaks before plunging everything back into shadow. Somewhere behind the clouds, thunder growled like a warning. Rex sat in the passenger seat. Ears forward, body tense. He didn't flinch at the thunder. He was locked in, sensing something Ethan couldn't quite see yet. They had tracked the signal to a burner phone used briefly in a gas station outside Decorah, Iowa. 36 hours later, an old Forest Service map revealed something else: a log cabin. Long abandoned, deep in the woods, off the grid. Unregistered, almost erased. Except someone had stocked it with supplies 2 weeks ago. Firewood, canned goods, a generator. Ethan gripped the wheel tighter as the GPS went dark. Almost there. Boy, he muttered. Let's end this. The cabin emerged through the trees like a ghost. It was perched on a slight ridge, half covered in creeping moss and rain-slicked bark. No lights, no smoke, but the back window had been wiped clean, recently. A human presence was here. Ethan killed the engine. The storm was deafening now, hammering the truck like fists from above. He checked his sidearm, loaded an extra magazine. and clipped a flashlight to his vest. Rex was already at the door. Tail low, body coiled. They moved fast and silent. Ethan flanked the side wall, boots sinking into wet earth. He crept toward the door, flashlight off, letting the dim flicker of lightning guide him. A creak inside, then footsteps. He nodded to Rex, who waited, breathing sharp and steady. Then, crash, the front door burst open. Ethan barely had time to dive sideways before a round shattered the air beside his head. He hit the ground hard, rolled behind a rotted beam, and returned fire, a single controlled shot through the side wall. From inside came a voice. Smooth, calm, hollow. "You finally came, Detective." It was Dan Morrow, but the mask was gone now. There was no sermon in his voice. No piety, just cold, rehearsed amusement. "I thought it might be you," Morrow said. The dog knew, didn't he? Animals always do. People are slower. Ethan edged around the corner. Gun raised. "You've got nowhere left to run." A soft laugh echoed from the darkness. "I never ran. I waited. I was curious how long it would take before someone actually saw." His voice shifted, became harder. "It took years. You know how many times I sat across from cops, priests, parents, and not one of them looked beyond the collar." Another shot rang out, splintering the doorframe beside Ethan's head. Close. Too close. Rex growled low beside him. Teeth bared. "Ex-scout sniper." Ethan muttered. "That's how you got so good at this." Silence. Then Morrow replied. "Quieter now. The war gave me clarity. You kill once. You see it. Kill twice. You understand it. Then it just becomes necessary." Ethan moved. He ducked past a broken shutter, kicked open the side entrance, and swept into the cabin. It was bare bones. Cot, crates, weapons case open on the floor, and at the far wall, Morrow, drenched in sweat, face lit by lightning. He held a pistol in both hands. Calm, still, predator. Ethan leveled his weapon. "Drop it." Morrow smiled. "No." He fired. The shot hit Ethan in the shoulder. Pain tore through him as he dropped to a knee. His weapon clattered from his hand and slid across the floor. Morrow advanced, step by step. "I watched the boy die. You know," he said, voice steady, almost proud. "Lucas, quiet one, didn't even scream. He knew what was coming." Ethan's hand reached behind him. Too far from the gun. Too slow. Morrow raised his pistol again. But then, a snarl ripped through the air. Rex. He came from the doorway like a missile, fur-soaked. Eyes blazing. He slammed into Morrow with bone-cracking force. Teeth sinking deep into the man's forearm. The pistol fired again, wild, into the ceiling, and clattered to the floor. Morrow screamed, buckling under the weight of the dog. Thrashing. Rex held on, growling, dragging him down like prey in a hunt. Ethan gritted his teeth, staggered forward, and grabbed his weapon. One clean shot into the floorboards beside Morrow's head. The message was clear. "It's over." Rex released his hold, teeth slick with blood, standing guard as Morrow writhed and gasped. Ethan stepped over him, Eyes cold. You murdered children. You wore a collar while you hunted them. Morrow looked up, blood on his chin. And you think putting me in a cage changes that? Ethan didn't answer. Outside, sirens approached, faint at first. Then louder. The FBI. Backup. Everything they needed to bring him in. Ethan lowered his gun and crouched beside Rex. "You did good," he said softly. Rex nudged his arm, tail wagging weakly despite the chaos. Ethan winced, hand pressed to the wound in his shoulder. It would heal. He would heal. Somehow. Hours later, as dawn broke and the storm receded, Morrow was loaded into an armored van. Bloodied, shackled, eyes empty, Griggs stood beside Ethan outside the cabin. Arms crossed. "He's going to rot in a box for the rest of his life," she said, "but what he did won't be forgotten." Ethan nodded, silent. Rex lay at his feet, finally resting. Griggs looked down. "That dog saved your life." Ethan looked toward the forest, still dark beyond the ridge. "No," he said. "He saved something more than that." She didn't ask what. Some truths didn't need to be spoken. Some storms passed, but the scars they left stayed forever. The snow had melted. Chicago was still cold, but spring crept in quietly, through cracks in sidewalks, through the pale sunlight that stretched longer across the lake, through the silence that followed closure. The Lucas Mayer case, after 12 years of dust and neglect, had finally come to rest. Not with full peace, but with truth. That, Ethan Cole had learned, was sometimes the most anyone could ask for. Dan Morrow, now stripped of title and reputation, awaited trial in federal custody. The charges against him stretched beyond what the public could stomach. Crimes committed under the shield of faith. In the name of trust. Across state lines. Across years. The task force had worked around the clock. Griggs coordinated interagency communication. Teams identified the remains of at least 3 other victims found through Morrow's trail, each disappearance long marked as a cold case. Forensics provided closure. DNA gave names to bones. Parents, siblings, and friends gathered at memorials that were never supposed to happen. But Lucas Mayer had led him there. And now the world knew his name. Rex's bandage had come off 3 days ago. The bite wound he'd taken during the cabin confrontation was shallow, clean through the flank. No deep tissue damage. He'd barely seemed to notice. But the online world had. Hero dog of Chicago, Rex the German Shepherd takes down fugitive pastor. K9 warrior survives gunfight. Ends decade-long cold case. Within a week, someone launched a GoFundMe for Rex's retirement cabin fund. It passed $80 by day 5. Another group began pushing for a statue. Children sent drawings to the precinct. One crayon sketch showed Rex flying with a cape. Ethan kept that one in his desk drawer. But none of the praise changed Rex. He remained as he always had, steady, alert, loyal, still waking when Ethan stirred in the night, still sitting by the window when rain came, still watching the world with quiet eyes. Ethan often wondered if Rex remembered every face, every scent, every scream. Some animals didn't forget. The day Ethan drove to the Mayer home, The sky was overcast and heavy. He hadn't been told to go. No cameras waited, no reporters, just something unfinished inside him that wouldn't leave until he made the drive. The house sat on a modest street near the western edge of the city. Red brick, peeling white shutters, a garden left untouched through winter. It looked lived in, but quiet, too quiet. He parked across the street. Rex sat beside him, unmoving. "I won't be long," Ethan said. But when he opened the door, Rex followed anyway. They crossed the road together. Ethan raised his hand to knock. The door opened before his knuckles touched the wood. She was older than the picture he'd seen. Paler, smaller, hair grayer now, but her eyes, those were the same ones in Lucas's photo. She said nothing, neither did he. They just looked at each other. And then, slowly, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. Ethan didn't resist. He held her the way he hadn't held anyone in years. Not since his wife's passing. Not since the war. Not since grief had taught him silence was safer than sorrow. She wept into his shoulder. No sobbing, no shaking, just the kind of quiet crying that comes from a well too deep to empty. When they pulled apart, she opened the door wider. He understood. They stepped inside. The house smelled like lavender and old fabric. Faint dust. The kind of smell that clings to rooms that haven't been touched too much. Like memories too sacred to disturb. She led him down a short hallway. Stopped at a door. Lucas's name was on it. A paper sign. Hand-drawn. Slightly tilted. She opened it. Inside, time had frozen. A small bed with blue sheets. A shelf lined with plastic dinosaurs. A desk covered in neat books, some adventure, some fantasy. A model rocket stood on the window sill. The blinds were half drawn. Ethan stepped in slowly. Rex waited at the threshold. Ears lowered. The room was heartbreakingly intact. "I clean it once a week," she said, voice hoarse. "Every Friday, same as always." Ethan looked at her, then back at the room. "You never moved?" She shook her head. "I couldn't. He might have come back. I didn't want him to be lost." She gestured to the bed. "I used to sit there. At night. Just. Waiting. For anything. A knock. A shadow. A dream." Ethan's chest ached. "I'm sorry," he said, "for how long it took. For how long he was out there without justice." She nodded slowly. "But you found him. It wasn't praise. It wasn't thanks. It was acknowledgement. Truth shared between two people who had carried ghosts far too long." She turned then, walked over to Rex, and knelt. He didn't move. She placed her hand on his head. "Thank you," she whispered. Rex closed his eyes. They stayed for another hour. They didn't talk much. She made tea. They sat by the window and listened to the wind. At one point, she showed him a photo album. Lucas at 5, playing in the leaves. At 7, building a snowman. At 10, smiling at the camera with a book in his lap. Ethan never cried, but something inside him softened. Loosened. Not healed, but less tight. When he finally stood to leave, she walked him to the door. They paused there for a moment. "You'll come again?" she asked. He nodded. "If you'd like." She gave a faint smile. He would have liked Rex. Ethan looked down at the dog. Everyone does. She reached out and squeezed his arm. Then stepped back. And Ethan walked away. Outside, spring waited at the edge of winter. As they crossed the street again, Rex stopped suddenly, turned back, looked at the house, and then turned forward again. Ethan opened the door, and they climbed into the truck. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel haunted, just quiet, and sometimes that was the beginning of peace. Back at the precinct that night, he pulled the crayon drawing from his desk, the one of Rex with the cape, and pinned it to the corkboard beside his old commendations. Then he sat, leaned back in his chair, and breathed. Somewhere, far off, thunder rolled, but here, for now, there was calm, forgiveness, not spoken, just shared, in silence.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.